On this 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time, let's take our bearings and navigate our faith together, trusting God to guide our hearts along the journey of everyday life. The 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time draws our attention to the profound superabundance of God's grace and His desire to nourish us both physically and spiritually. In a world where we often feel depleted, anxious, or hungry for meaning, the liturgy reminds us that God is the ultimate provider who satisfies our deepest longings. The readings for this Sunday vividly illustrate this divine providence, from the prophet Isaiah's invitation to a heavenly banquet to St. Paul's unwavering confidence in the unbreakable love of Christ, and finally to the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of Matthew. The central message is clear: God abundantly provides for those who come to Him. Let us chart the deeper historical and theological waters of today's readings, discovering the timeless truths that anchor our faith. First, in Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 3, we hear an invitation to grace. Written during the Babylonian exile, this passage speaks to a displaced and weary people. The invitation to come to the water and receive wine and milk without cost is a powerful metaphor for God's unmerited grace. In a culture where survival depended on hard labor and costly resources, God offers true spiritual sustenance for free. This passage foreshadows the new covenant and the Eucharistic banquet, where God freely gives His very self to satisfy the spiritual hunger of His people. Next, in Psalm 145, we see God's providence. The responsorial psalm reinforces the theme of divine care. By declaring that the hand of the Lord feeds us, the psalmist acknowledges God as the source of all sustenance. It reflects a theology of absolute trust in a Creator who is intimately involved in the preservation and flourishing of His creation. Then, in Romans chapter 8, verses 35 and 37 through 39, we learn about the unbreakable bond. St. Paul provides one of the most triumphant declarations of Christian hope in the New Testament. He lists extreme earthly sufferings, including famine, which connects to the theme of hunger, and definitively states that they cannot sever a bond between a believer and Christ. The Greek word for conquer overwhelmingly, hypernikomen, implies victory that goes far beyond mere survival. It is a total triumph through the power of God's love. Finally, in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21, we witness the feeding of the 5,000. This narrative is deeply Eucharistic. After hearing of John the Baptist's death, Jesus seeks solitude, yet He is moved with compassion for the crowds. The sequence of actions, Jesus taking the bread, looking up to heaven, blessing it, breaking it, and giving it to the disciples, exactly mirrors the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. The 12 leftover baskets symbolize superabundance and represent the 12 tribes of Israel, indicating that God's grace is more than enough to gather and sustain all His people. To help navigate these ancient texts, let's illuminate their profound mysteries using everyday analogies as a compass for our modern faith journey. Imagine you have been walking through a scorching desert for days. You are exhausted, parched, and your pockets are completely empty. Suddenly, you stumble upon a magnificent oasis with a lavish feast laid out on tables. A host stands there, welcoming you to eat and drink everything you want, completely for free. This is the image the prophet Isaiah uses to describe God's love. We often spend our energy, our time, and our money on things that do not truly satisfy us, like chasing status, superficial relationships, or temporary pleasures. God invites us to stop paying for what fails to satisfy, and instead accept His free gift of grace. The gospel story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes takes this idea a step further. The disciples look at the massive crowd and panic because they only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They focus on what they lack. But Jesus takes their small, seemingly insignificant offering and transforms it into a feast that feeds thousands, with baskets of food left over. This teaches us a beautiful lesson about how God works in our lives. Often we feel like we do not have enough, not enough time, not enough patience, not enough talent, or not enough faith. We might look at a difficult situation in our family or at work and think, I can't handle this. Jesus tells us not to send the problem away, but to bring what little we have to Him. When we place our small efforts, our limited patience, or our modest talents into the hands of God, He blesses them and multiplies them in ways we could never imagine. Furthermore, as St. Paul reminds us, even when we go through times of famine or distress, God's love acts as a safety net that never breaks. With our spiritual bearings set, let's chart a clear course of actionable steps to steer our personal, family, and professional lives by the light of today's message. In your personal life, take an honest inventory of where you spend your time and energy. Are you spending your money for what is not bread? Identify one habit or pursuit that drains you spiritually and replace it this week with a practice that truly nourishes your soul, such as 15 minutes of quiet prayer or reading scripture. In your family life, when conflicts or exhausting situations arise at home, it is easy to feel like you only have 5 loaves and 2 fish worth of patience. Instead of reacting in frustration, pause and consciously offer that small amount of patience to God in a brief, silent prayer. Trust Him to multiply your grace to handle the situation with love. And in your professional life, bring your limited resources to God rather than relying solely on yourself. When facing an overwhelming project or a difficult coworker, start your workday by mentally handing the challenge over to Christ. Trust that your honest effort, even if it feels inadequate, is enough for God to work with and bring about a positive outcome. In summary, the readings for this 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time profoundly illustrate that God is the ultimate provider, who desires to nourish us with His superabundant grace, inviting us to stop seeking fulfillment in worldly things that fail to satisfy. Through the prophetic imagery of Isaiah's free banquet, Paul's assurance of Christ's unbreakable love, and the Eucharistic foreshadowing in the miraculous multiplication of the loaves and fishes, we learn that God's compassion always meets our deepest needs. Because God can take our smallest, most inadequate offerings and multiply them beyond measure, we must consciously offer our limited patience, time, and talents to Him each day, especially when facing overwhelming family or workplace challenges, trusting that His grace is more than sufficient to sustain us.